This episode, I'm joined by Bill Sharp, who is an independent researcher on the work of Ralph Borsodi. In this episode, we discuss the life and work of Borsodi, as well as discussing his main text, This Ugly Civilization, alongside discussions on sustainability, Georgism, and technology. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermetics or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Okay, so Bill Sharp, thanks very much for joining us on Hermetics podcast. We are going to be discussing the work of Ralph Borsodi. Now, I got turned on to Ralph Borsodi by Jakob Lund Fisker, who's written a book on retiring early, and he recommended Borsodi to me. And there isn't too much that it's all in print, but there's nothing which has really been reworked or worked with recently until this 90th anniversary edition of what is sort of seems to be commonly understood as Borsodi's sort of magnum opus, which is called The Ugly Civilization, which was originally published in 1929. And this is a book of societal and technological critique, which also includes the economic foundation of Georgism, which in its day was huge. Someone actually told me that is it Progress and Prosperity, I believe it's called, one of the sort of foundational texts of Georgism outsold the Bible for a brief time. So that's another thing, which is
the Henry George text. You're talking about the Henry George text?
Yeah, the Henry George text.
Yeah.
It was crazily, insanely popular. But before we jump into all these specifics, sorry, Bill, I got a bit carried away there. Just briefly introduce yourself, a bit about your work, and how did this, what's your relationship with Borsodi? How did this sort of come about?
Did you want some background first, or shall we just jump into Borsodi?
It'd be great to know a little bit about you, some background.
Okay. Well, I'm sort of a jack of all trades. Grew up in a small agricultural town in Arkansas, which sort of defined my values. In those days, high school counselor thought I'd make a good rocket scientist. I wanted to be a historian. Ended up as a sociologist working in community and economic development. And I basically worked in, I was a college professor, worked in government from state to local, served in public office, in fact. I've worked in business, quite an array of businesses, including high-tech startups. And I've been a nonprofit co-founder of about a half a dozen nonprofits. My background is in community and economic development, but due to the little bit of science background I had, it turned out that I could develop the computer systems. So I ended up spending a great deal of my life as an information technology project planner and developer. So I laid the groundwork from punch cards to what we're doing here.
Wow.
But I'm also an avid outdoorsman, environmentalist since being a Boy Scout, hiked Colorado and Arizona, where I lived a great part of my career, hiked thousands of miles, camping trips, et cetera. And most recently, about 10 years ago, I founded Transition Center, which has a sustainability, community resiliency background. And that is how I found out about Borsodi.
I see. Do you feel there's a connection between your sort of career in IT and your love of the outdoors? Was it like an escape from the IT? Did you enjoy the IT?
More or less. I didn't like the technical side, but my job was primarily working between the business side and the geeks. And that part I liked. I dropped out of engineering because one day I realized that we were talking about machines and transformers and all sorts of stuff, and I wanted to work with people. So when I did get into IT, I pretty much got into working with people, help them develop the systems, do the training, help them create the corporate culture that gave them a sense that they could work that way.
Okay. Now I'm seeing, where Ralph Borsodi sort of fits in there. He's sort of all about drawing the human back into, the factory, removing the factory from the home, and actually sort of bringing the human back. So that fits. So before we sort of, get into the specifics of Borsodi, I mean, you've already given me your three, but I have to ask you the Hermetics question. You can place three thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick and why?
Um, the three, well, we pretty much mentioned them. Borsodi would be one of them. Bucky Fuller would be another, and Alfred Korzybski would be the third.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that all three of them had extraordinary insights into the way life works. And all three of them devoted their life to helping people live better by using the qualities that nature endowed on us, which is what's back here behind the forehead. So they tried to help us do that better.
Okay. Where do you think that a conversation between those three might immediately lead? What do you think would be a common thread which they might all, gravitate towards?
Well, actually, both Borsodi and Fuller knew Korzybski's work well. So I think they would have settled down. Korzybski wrote a book called Manhood of Humanity. And this was after his experience as a frontline intelligence officer in World War I for the Russian army, which he carried the injuries all of his life. But he developed this book to begin to propose a way for people to learn and to live a better life. And he developed Science and Sanity. So I think they would have probably started out with his thesis. How is it, which all of them were interested in, how is it that we can learn to live a better life as a human race, not just as an individual, but as a human race in general? They were all three humanists. They had a broader perspective. They looked at the world.
Did they all have an agreement on what it is to be better, to live better? Was there something where almost perhaps we're getting into the problem itself already, but a quantifiable marker, so you could say we're living better in some way, or was it more of a an abstract, almost utopian idea of what the future should look like?
Well, all three of them are very practical. Fuller particularly said, make it visible. And both Korzybski and Borsodi, all three of them had the ability to think in an abstract term that would drive a university professor crazy. They had that ability to think very deeply. They were all extremely well informed. They probably all had photographic memories and read hundreds and thousands of books. So they had that intellectual deal, but all of them understood that the universe works in a certain way and we are a part of that universe. All three of them definitely believed we were an organism in an environment and we had to learn to live within the context of nature. So all of them, and I just happened to do my graduate thesis on learning and living. And it just turns out that all three of those had the same perspective. So, we use our brain to understand the world around us. We consult the books, the accumulated wisdom of humankind, which all three use that term. We've accumulated a vast amount of experience over the course of history, and we need to access that. And it's not just the Western side, it's the whole world. In fact, Borsodi loved Confucius. I think it was probably the cornerstone of his work. But again, a man who was looking at how we educate people to be better citizens, to make their societies, their own lives, their family lives, and their societies work better. So all of them were very practical in their orientation. All of them did things, a lot of things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Out of the three, though, do you think that Borsodi is the one that's almost been the most, forgotten and just completely pushed to the side? As we said before we started, that Bucky Fuller, he's got a bit, he's fairly well known, but the other two, Borsodi seems to be the one that's completely dropped off the radar there. I don't know if you'd agree.
Yes, he has.
Why do you think that is?
Well, for one thing, he was difficult, and for another thing, when his close associate Mildred Loomis died, all the legacy material, there was the Risotti Memorial Library. There were boxes and boxes and boxes of material that developed by the school living over the years. But when Mildred died, all of that was dispersed. The books went out of print. The school of living no longer supported the basic mission. So there was nothing left there for him. You indicated that you were going to be, well, Bucky Fuller, his material is all over the place. In fact, I noticed recently that his World Game is being brought back on board by the Schumacher Center. And the Schumacher Center partner of Borsodi's, Bob Swan, is an excellent example of how a founder legacy was preserved, both Schumacher's and Swan's. So, both sides happened. But they built a library, and they sort of sanctified the material that went into it. You're going to interview Corey Anton, maybe a couple of other people related to general semantics. The International Institute still exists. And I participated in it for a number of years. You can still get all the books. They're doing seminars, et cetera, et cetera. So they've got an organization that preserved it. With the School of Living, 1986 was total discontinuity. The material just disappeared. But Mildred left a biography of Borsodi that was actually published after her death. And I was given a copy of that, and reading it started raising a lot of questions in my mind. And as I began to think about it, which is just one way I do, I go into biographies of people that interest me. As I began to think about it, I started looking around trying to collect resources. Getting started with this, I was doing Transition Towns, which came out of the UK, Rob Hopkins and all. But it spread across the United States starting in 2008, and I started Transition Center in 2009. And in the process of starting that up, met a guy who was a homesteader in the School of Living, who lives not far from here. And he and I were walking over the hill behind his little farmstead one day, and he started telling me about this Borsodi guy. And then he gave me the book, and it just kind of got me started. But over the years, Bob Flatley is his name, over the year, and he was the last editor of the Green Revolution, which was the journal of the School of Living it was that title since 1963. And for the last 10 years that it ran, he and I partnered trying to find material to try to restore and revive the Borsodi legacy. Mm-hmm. So that kind of got it started. But over the course of the year, I managed to collect some material, found people that sent me some stuff that was of use, visited archives, and just sort of put the picture together. And that is that's coming pretty much to a closure now. I finished one of the two books on that legacy, the one that's devoted to education, and I'm working on the last chapter, the one that was mostly devoted on the homesteading, the back to the land side of it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. Sorry.
Between them, there's about 600 or 700 pages of material I've managed to collect.
That's a lot. That's as someone who's sort of in depth in that sort of research at the moment. It's tough. But it's interesting. We both approach tackle a thinker in the same way there, that you start with a biography. People you're interested in. A lot of people ignore biographies straight to the ideas, the work. And in some cases, perhaps the biography isn't too important, but, maybe that's a question for you. Do you, as someone who's really, obviously been deep within this stuff now for a long time, do you think Borsodi's biography, his place within the world, his context within the world is important to his work?
I didn't hear the last part.
Do you think Borsodi's biography, his context within the world, the time he lived in, do you think that's important to his work, or do you think it was his work was something that could be, born in any time?
His work was any time. In fact, his basic system, the problem-based system that he put together, it was universal major problems of living. And he basically defined that as the type of problems that people in every time and in every place on the earth today have in common. They are the universal problems. And like I said, he goes back, he did exhaustive work in trying to build a taxonomy of all the different ideas people have had so that you could look into them and choose the one that was most appropriate for the problem that you had at the time. But no, it is absolutely universal, going back to the beginning of history. Because of the work he started in 1920. Started his homestead, and that was a year of. Actually, it was the worst, other than the Great Depression. It was one of the four worst economic upsets we've seen in the last 100 years. But it was also a pandemic of greater proportions than the one we're facing now.
Mm-hmm.
So he left the city in a state of high crisis. But he worked on his homestead for about 14 years. He still worked in the city, but he had his homestead for about 14 years before he put the school of living together. And that was at the absolute depth of the Great Depression, 1934. So his work was about the type of crises that people deal with. He thought that we did need, we're going to get into this. He found a lot of difficulties with the industrial economy. He thought that we needed to get back to a more agrarian type of life. But he also thought that we needed to have a program to help us deal with the conditions that we face, because he knew these things weren't going to go away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So he begins, we mentioned at the start, he begins from an economic foundation, which in his day was beyond well known. The work of Henry George. I mean, this was super, super popular, and sort of in the same vein as Borsodi has sort of not so much gone off the map, but you're not going to hear about it in economics class. You'll probably hear about the Austrians before you hear about Henry George. So how would you sort of explain Borsodi's economic understanding of the world?
Okay, Henry George had a great deal to do with it. But he was also a practicing consulting economist and an accountant working on Wall Street. He worked mostly in the retail business. He was quite an expert on marketing and advertising. He was sort of, his father was actually sort of one of the madmen of his time. He was a master at advertising, and actually you can find several of his books on advertising on Amazon, reprints of them, William Borsodi. But his father was an immigrant from Hungary, where he was involved in land issues there. He came to the United States probably about 1895 and got in New York and got involved in the Henry George movement. So Borsodi literally grew up in that environment. His father knew all the leading Georgists of the time, wrote an introduction to one of the leading books on Back to the Land by a guy named Bolton Hall, who was somebody that Borsodi knew to the end of his life. So that was a foundation, but like I said, at age 15, Borsodi was editing the Georgist newsletter. He was teaching classes, and he was actually standing on soapboxes on the corners of Greenwich Village delivering speeches. So he was quite an advocate of George. But on the other side, he was doing very practical economic consulting with some major corporations and wrote a book on accounting, his first book. So he had a very solid background. I think he was self-taught in both cases. As far as I know, he did not attend school beyond 15. And even though he has a master's degree and an honorary doctorate, I don't think he ever spent a day in college. So he learned things on his own.
Okay. I mean, I think that's sort of important in terms of his probably where a lot of the currents from his work come from. Is I guess he's someone who would never be able to be pulled into that environment either. The sort of process-based schooling that people like Ivan Illich talk about, where you're just you're just a cog in the machine going through the motions. Then Borsodi does not come across as one of those types. So, I mean, would it be possible to give a brief outline of Georgism, or is it too complex to sort of say what its key tenets are?
Well, the key tenet is it is complex. It's a big book. And you're right, it's sold. I mean, it sold 3 million copies in his lifetime alone. Um, and there are some leading economists today who still study George. I think Milton Friedman is one of them. So he has not been forgotten by the official economic um, profession. George was also another self-educated man. He started life as a seaman, ended up like Borsodi as a typesetter for newspapers, became a journalist himself. So again, he was a self-educated individual. Um, but his key thesis was that land held in speculation was no longer available to people who needed it and could use it uh, for their own living.
Mm-hmm.
So that was back in the days when they were building the railroads, coast to coast railroads. Uh, Millions of square miles were going to the railroads for their own use. Um, Industry was coming on very, very strong, dominating, actually overwhelming the agricultural culture, as well as the market. Um, so his basic thesis was that we needed to put land into public trust and make it available for anybody who wanted it on a lease basis.
Mm-hmm.
So whether they wanted to farm or create a business, they could lease the land. They would continue to own anything that they develop, buildings and stuff. And by the way, the School of Living still uses, and most land trusts still use that model. But that was the basic thesis. We had to return the land back to the people.
Okay. So does Borsodi sort of take this and understand that industry, I've got this question about right at the beginning of this ugly civilization. Borsodi mentions, our markers for progress and success are noise, busyness, hustle and bustle. Does he sort of see that this form of industry with this form of noise is almost overtaking our, that very practical? Well, hang on, we've got all this hustle and bustle, but what about the things people actually need? What about the basics of living? What about having this sustainable life? Industry is overtaking this all, so we need to sort of step back and understand what are even our markers of whether or not something's good or bad.
Okay, well, in Borsodi's view, the city was a product of the industrial economy. They start to build the factories. Started at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of land reform driving people off the land into the cities, which were big, bustling, crowded, confusing. There was disease and poverty and squalor and crime in them. So from the beginning, cities have always been, they're unnatural places.
Mm-hmm.
And from Borsodi's perspective, the only way to be a human being was to get back to living close to nature.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the back to the land movement. The Georgists were a part of that, but also as Borsodi was becoming active in the Georgia Society, there was a country life program being launched in the United States. President Theodore Roosevelt was a champion of it. So it was a reaction basically against industrialization. It was a reaction by the agrarian culture in this country, which was still strong. They were called the Populists, Grangers, various names. But it was a massive undertaking. And, a lot of people were talking about this industrial society was dangerous. There had been a series of really serious economic panics. 1893 was a really serious one. And during that time was probably when the back to the land movement actually started. Bolton Hall started writing books about it. But there were urban farms, urban gardens. These are talking about quarter acre gardens where people could raise enough food for their family and also have a surplus to sell in the local market. But there was also a movement to get people back to the land. But when the Depression hit, Borsodi's book, This Ugly Civilization, came out at just the right time. Part of what he presented in that was the first report on his homesteading effort. And it was published in a national magazine as a series even before that. So he was getting a lot of popular interest. But then the Great Depression hit, and one of the things that people started to do, if they could, is go back to the farm.
Mm-hmm.
But a movement sprung up across the country. Since the government under Hoover would not wouldn't invest money into the recovery, there was a lot of encouragement for local communities to start homesteading projects. And it happened probably at least 100 communities around the country started these. And Borsodi was basically called to one in Dayton, Ohio. And that was where he started to morph from being a homesteader to thinking about building homestead communities. But at that time, and there's a YouTube recording of him, the only voice recording that I know that still exists. There used to be a lot of them, and I think there may still be some in archives. But he is, he's coming out like a lot of other people did about the impact of the machine age. Now, what his argument against the machine was, getting back to that question of the city, mm-hmm. is the centralization of the economy. Mm-hmm. So a lot of big companies made the products, and they used railroads, warehouses, distribution. And he wrote actually 2 books on consumer advocacy books. One of the things he was a pioneer of is consumer advocacy, basically talking about the unnecessary expense of all of these things. Well, that economy totally collapsed in 1929. And even today, when we go into recession, one of the things you will find is that people will start gardening again. So they'll start thinking about growing food. In fact, this last year in the United States, we literally ran out of seeds early in the season.
Wow.
People could not find seeds for gardening. And that happened the last recession too. I was doing a garden training program at that time. But, there was just a lot of people got real serious about growing more of their own food, getting more security. Risotti, with his homestead to start with, and the school living after that, well, I guess he wouldn't like it, but he created sort of an industrial strength back to the land movement.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the seeds being sold out. We've recently, past couple of years, our rate of usage of allotments in the UK has gone up something like 80%. Everyone is going back to that. But actually, a lot of laws within the cities actually disallow people to grow veg on their land. So please come around and actually dig up perfectly good veg, and especially in front gardens, which is probably the most ridiculous laws ever made. But there you go. That's laws for you.
Yeah, we have that here too. There's a lot of restrictions on gardening. In fact, we just got through our township, small township, just finally, after 3 or 4 times of looking at it, finally allowed local citizens to have chickens in their backyard.
That's crazy. That's crazy. I mean,
yeah, and there is a question even now under our laws whether or not you can have a private garden on a residential property. So yeah, there are a lot of those restrictions. Transition towns, again in the UK, going back 10, 12 years, actually did attempt to address those issues. So community gardens were a very major part of that. Rob Hopkins was a permaculture teacher, wrote a doctorate dissertation on permaculture, and he put a lot of emphasis on how to use permaculture to help develop local food systems. So that's still around. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's still a major part of Transition Center program, is to redevelop local food systems. But again, it gets back to the fundamentals of it was agriculture established civilization. And when it really gets down to the basics, what do you need? You need food, you need shelter, you need a bit of security. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the land, as Henry George made it very clear, having a little bit of land allowed you to achieve that security that was not available being a wage slave in industry.
So really, the laws that are being passed, in that sense of you can't have food, you can't have chickens, as we were talking about. These laws are actually sort of what Borsodi is addressing, in the fact that as soon as those laws are in place, the centralization of the factory, of supermarkets, of the supply chain, that centralization is bolstered, because as an individual consumer, you no longer have a choice of
No.
where you can get your stuff. So you either
Yeah.
rely on a centralized industrial megamart, or you don't eat.
Yeah. And working on the revamping the local food system, and there's an army of people working on that in the United States. Um, it is an uphill battle.
Mm-hmm.
It is
Mm-hmm.
very difficult to get through all the regulations, the dominance of the of agricultural business um, these days. We had a major organization here, a state level organization that was devoted to sustainable agriculture, small farms. Um, and during the last 2 years, with the tariffs with China and also the pandemic impact on the farms, a huge amount of money went into industrial agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
But we noticed something in this latest stimulus bill. There is actually about $10 billion being devoted to small farmers, particularly disadvantaged minority farmers in this country, that are beginning to recognize that there is another aspect to this.
Mm-hmm.
With Borsodi, Henry George, getting back to this, Henry George believed that the land should go into the public domain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And over the years, very little of that actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
Borsodi's contribution to this was that he believed land needed to be held in trust,
Mm-hmm.
in private trust. And that is the model that he developed with the school living, which, by the way, is one of his legacies. The
Mm-hmm.
idea of community land trust that he developed in 1934 and redeveloped again in the mid 60s has now become a national institution. Governments are still owning the land, but they are putting property into trust. Most of it is residential. But there is also a pretty widespread community land trust among mostly communes and intentional communities across the country. So, but that was his major shift from George, that we got to get the government out of it. The Roosevelt administration destroyed the back to the land movement during the Great Depression. They came in, administered it, promised a lot of money. The money didn't come, and over 100 of those, maybe as many as 200 or 300, because they came in, those experiments all failed. Again, it was centralization, which really got Borsodi and a lot of other folks quite upset over the idea that government could come in and take over and even do good things. So it's industry, it's the economy in general, particularly with the finance community, and it's government. All of those, in his opinion, needed to be decentralized down to the community level. And again, there is a distributionist philosophy. It's called decentralism. A lot of that distributionist philosophy came out of the UK.
Mm-hmm.
It was inspired by a number of leaders 125 years ago. And Borsodi was one of a group of people who sort of picked it up and popularized it. He became a leader of that concept in the United States. And there is still some interest in revival of that concept.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, there was always, even around Borsodi, there was a strong interest out of certain religious communities to see that would happen. And they had the capacity to create institutions that were not under government control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And those are still going on in this country. In fact, there's a couple of 3 good books that have come out recently on that.
Really? What are the titles?
I'd have to send them to you.
Okay.
I can't think of them offhand.
So these trusts, is there something? I mean, just put simply, is there something in the clauses which stop them from becoming, industrialized or agribiz? Is there something that says this land has to be this or that?
Yeah, it goes into the deed. There is a section of law about trust. They can be broken, but increasingly in the United States, there is a major farmland trust movement, and it's backed by federal law. And once you put that land in trust, it is perpetually held as agricultural property. It can never be developed. In fact, what happens is that the people that put the land in trust buy the development rights from the farmer, which is sort of the same thing as buying the mineral rights. Mm-hmm. You have total control over how that land can be used, and that is in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it is there.
Okay. Now, thus far, I think you could sort of forgive someone for being mistaken and thinking that Borsodi is, maybe like almost a Luddite, super anti-technology or anti-technological progress. I mean, is there any truth to that in his criticisms of the city? What's his relationship to technology? Is there some point where he draws a line in what's genuinely progressive or innovative and what's genuinely harmful to the human?
Yep. Yes, and he was not anti-technology by any means. In fact, I think if he was alive today, you'd be talking to him on this screen. Actually, Borsodi, you may be aware that E.F. Schumacher was credited with appropriate technology in the 70s. Borsodi actually developed it in the 20s. When he moved to his homestead, the first thing he did was get electricity run in. He bought an electric range, put in a water heater, pumps for his well, but he also bought a used electric motor and put it on his flour mill. Mm-hmm. He was always a champion of mechanization on a small scale in order to reduce the drudgery. And he made, as an economist, he made a very strong business case for this motorized homesteading. Mm-hmm. In the 1930 census, with radio just coming on, he had a radio in his house. The census counted radios; they were so scarce. So yeah, he tapped into technology. He wasn't opposed to technology. He wasn't blanketly opposed to the factory system. He said that we could get rid of 2/3 of the factory simply because most of that stuff could be done in the home. And again, the documentation, the casework, the business case is made that it takes fewer hours to produce all of these goods in the home than it does to make the money to buy them, and the quality is much higher. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it wasn't, he was never anti-technology, but he was against massive industry. I think he would have been very happy to have the factory system broken up and small factories placed in towns and regions around the country, so you wouldn't be dependent on all that distribution service. Which, by the way, the American farmer gets about 6 cents out of every food dollar.
Wow, I think it's roughly the same in the UK. There's not much money, here at all. I think it's mostly subsidized.
No, so everything goes into the distribution processing network.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what do you?
True then.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
What I was going to say.
True then, and it still is.
So, in what sense? I mean, I guess to play devil's advocate, when you say that the paper's there, the proof's there, that if we create these things in our home, then the quality's better, it takes less time. Then why do we still abide by that industrialized factory system?
Because that's what we've been conditioned to do.
Did Borsodi formulate a way to decondition people?
Yes. In fact, it's in that book, This Ugly Civilization, his first approach to it. Mm-hmm. You ask the question about quality versus quantity. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he began, a good part of the book is the barriers to living the good life that he put in that book. And it was basically his belief that people had been conditioned. He came up a little bit later in 1948 with the idea of miseducation. The schools were conditioning us to live in an industrial sort of way, and miseducation is another word for propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
It is pure and simple conditioning. And if you looked around the schools at that time, they looked like factories, and people were being then and still are going to schools and colleges for the purpose of finding a place in the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They still do. They still do. I remember, I've told this story probably quite a few times on the podcast, but I remember it's probably one of the few good lessons I got in Western education, which was not to take for granted what came out of a tap. You know, we generally in the West, if you've got a home, if you're living the normal Western life, you go to a tap and you simply expect that water will come out of it. And I remember thinking after that basically really the first thing schools should teach is those sort of Borsodian ideals, which is, what are you going to eat? Where are you going to, how's your shelter? Do you know how your shelter is built? Do you know where your food comes from? Do you even know how to get that food? And it's always been a question for me is why don't people want to think about that? And I always theorize that maybe it's because they didn't want to admit that if things went bad for a short time, they've got no, recourse. They don't know what to do at all. And we saw this in the 80s with the truck strikes in the UK, where they stopped for 48 hours, and within 48 hours, there's no food in the supermarkets. And it's it's a big question. I think Borsodi's trying to deal with that in that sense of dealing with your, we will never get away from those direct primary needs.
No, you can't. And by the way, if you read history,
Mm-hmm.
From Spengler to Sorokin to Toynbee, including some modern historians, 21st century historians like Diamond and Painter,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You learn an interesting pattern about the end of civilizations. People leave the city and go back to the land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is a universal pattern. And Toynbee made that case with study of 24 civilizations, all of which failed except ours, and even back in the 40s and 50s, he's saying, and this is looking pretty bad.
Yeah.
So, eventually you get down to that. And with there is a local food movement. Like I said, transition towns was a very strong part of getting that going. In fact, that trucking stoppage was one of the things that mobilized Hopkins to form transition towns when he realized just how fragile the system was. But we've also seen, when the pandemic started, we also saw that shelves in stores were beginning to empty out.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it was the more centralized distributors that kept things going. So we have to give them a little credit for that. But, a lot of foods, toilet paper, other paper products just basically disappeared from the shelf for weeks, if not months. So we looked at the fact that there is an issue with the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing it to present time. I've got a pretty fair economics background myself.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one reason I can read Borsodi. But I spent a lot of time over the last 10 years looking at what are the potential conditions that we might experience. For Borsodi, it was the recessions. Factories just closed. People didn't have income. But one of the things that's coming out of sustainability is not so much climate change. Climate change is the number 2 punch that we've got to worry about. Mm-hmm. And you're beginning to see more and more of that just these last few weeks as the economies are beginning to look at moving forward. Mm. And there's going to be a lot of changes in the way we work, a lot of way we conduct businesses and education. But one of the things they're looking at is that people are suddenly have an awful lot of money. And if they start spending it, there's no capacity to produce it. But in the background of that is the supply chain. Mm-hmm. And some years back, there was a study done among major multinational corporations. What's the risk in your supply chain? Mm-hmm. The number 1 element in that list was water. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what that came down to was the agricultural products that they depended on. Mm-hmm. So a corollary to that was land and water. But energy, of course, is always another issue. You know, how much fossil fuel do we have? How fast can we replace it? Um, but, you know, we're talking about renewable energy, electric vehicles, um, wind generators. All of that technology depends on a group of elements called the rare earth elements. And there is an absolutely limited, finite supply, and the majority of them are in China.
Yeah, I mean, this is my favorite economic law, Liebig's law of the minimum. If
I know Liebig's law.
There we go. And that's the one which I always tell to people when they I mean, all my listeners will be probably grinning now that you've mentioned Tainter and Toynbee and Spengler, because that is that is sort of my go-to with these kind of things. But when it comes to renewable energy, people go, oh, and you know, looking at recent statistics, my favorite one at the moment is if solar panels want to equate for the energy that just Britain gets from oil, we would have to cover 40% of the land mass with solar panels. And at what point can you think that is in any way sustainable or renewable? I don't know. But as you say, with the rare earth elements and also the energy in to energy out ratio of agriculture, I think meat is 80 energy in to 1 out, and then plants is something like 12 to 1. So there's, you know, it's slowly going down.
The agricultural industry itself, is leader of that sustainable agriculture group, said that modern agriculture is turning oil into food, and overall for the agricultural system, it is about 8 to 10 calories of energy input for every calorie that you have on your plate. Now, this the industrialization of agriculture, what was called the other green revolution, when they started industrializing agriculture in developing countries, basically it was heavy mechanization. And it was also kicking people off the land. And what you're seeing in India today, and Gandhi was very strong. Risotti spent a lot of time in India working with Gandhi agrarians and educators. And Gandhi was very strong on the village level economy, just as Borsodi was. Risotti was sort of a superstar in India because of his views. But today, today in New Delhi, there are tens of thousands of farmers protesting government policy to take the land away from them. So that continuing process of industrializing subsistence farming, it just keeps going on. And it is going to be an issue, because even McKinsey, who is driving this major consulting firm, even McKinsey, who sees tremendous investment opportunities, was at least kind enough to say that, there's going to be a lot of profit in this massive industrialization of agriculture, but land and water are going to run out, and energy is going to be an issue. So what do you do when you're looking at that type of debacle occurring? And there's a non-family word that covers that.
Yeah. You're allowed to say it. It's fine.
I'll pass.
Okay.
But at any rate, we're looking at the possibility, and world population, development, all of these things as they come together in an economic equation indicate the fact that we're going to do one of two things. We're either going to do like the economists say and the businessmen say, we're going to have all the breakthroughs and we're going to have a Star Trek future with abundance and peace and prosperity for everything. Number two is or not.
That one's really mentioned, though. And anyone who does mention that is deemed a quack or a conspiracy theorist or etc. And but I mean that begs two questions, doesn't it? Because it begs the question of, I always say that I'm open to technology suddenly doing this miraculous cure everything, but I also say I'll believe it when I see it, and as of yet I haven't seen it. So then the Borsodi is answering a problem there, in that something else is happening at the same time, which is we're losing skills, right? When push comes to shove and we no longer have the energy to put in, all of a sudden we have generations and generations who have absolutely zero skills for farming or for veg growing. And, it's people joke and they say, what do you mean veg growing? You just put the seeds in the ground. That when I hear that, someone who's never grown veg, in their life, it's a long learning curve, especially when you need a good yield for a family of 4. And so I think, is this the question that Borsodi's, or the problem that Borsodi is trying to answer, is to say, we need to regain these skills, we need to retain these skills, we need to find a communal way to develop them in this school of living.
Yeah, and that's what he did. From the time he started his homestead, once he got settled down, he started inviting friends from the city to come and spend weekends to learn gardening so that they could start their own homesteads. But the school of living put this whole process on steroids. He developed one thing he called it was a research institute. He developed a long series of bulletins that were skills based, how to do this, how to do that, how to, do dairy, do canning, do laundry, build things. So he put an awful lot of emphasis on training people to get in to the necessary knowledge and skills that they needed. But the background he found was that you had to build an attitude. Mm-hmm. You had to understand why it was important to live that way of life. And if you're going to live that way of life, and you can become economically independent, which means it's a form of gaining personal freedom, mm-hmm. you and your family and your local community. And he says, and he also said, you gain a considerable amount of time to do something else. So you can do hobbies and crafts, or the best thing you can do is self-education. So you're living on the land, you're self-sufficient, self-reliant, you have achieved a degree of freedom that you're not going to find in city life. And now is the time to develop your higher abilities as a human being. Mm-hmm. So he layered those things. And as he worked through his program over the years, he went higher and higher and higher in that. When he was in India, he went for a short trip, but after he spoke a bit, he was asked to produce a document with his basic philosophy, and it came out as the Pan-Humanist Manifesto, later called a Decentralist Manifesto. And in that, he basically, one reason he was being kept there is that some of Gandhi's leaders were actually calling for a moratorium on higher education in India because they thought it was becoming too westernized. It wasn't meeting the cultural needs, including the idea of people still living and working on the land. Mm-hmm. So they asked him to stay to develop a curriculum, but one of the things that came out of that manifesto was an actual revolution, a green revolution, a peaceful revolution, based on education. And what he and the leaders in India were talking about was developing a corps of teachers who would serve in each community. And they weren't necessarily professional teachers, but they were people with an orientation to help other people learn what they needed to learn. So the whole spectrum is there, working with your hands, working with your head, and working with your heart.
Mm-hmm. And this is something you're clearly very passionate about, and this is something you're now you in your emails with me, you said that this is something did the School of Life go away because you sort of made it seem like you're now trying to bring it back, or did it just sort of lose its energy for a while?
It's still there.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a small land trust organization.
Mm-hmm.
It pretty much gave up the legacy, and it's never made any real attempt to restore it. I was a trustee for a while, trying to help guide it back into recovery of Borsodi legacy, and it just basically wasn't interested. Huh. So that connection to the past has been pretty much lost.
Oh, okay.
So they're still there. They've got a half a dozen land trusts that they manage, and they do a few, gardening courses and stuff like that. But reviving the Risotti Loomis legacy as it was during their lifetime is an altogether different thing.
Mm-hmm. Are you trying to do that at the moment?
Yes. That's what the books are for. The books, I went into the material. The books, they're still pretty heavy reading. But my idea was that you had to get in and find out what these guys said.
Mm-hmm.
But the next stage of that is to translate that into a workable philosophy and a style of presentation that's appropriate for people today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there are a small number of us that are seriously working on that. Now, how it will be organized, I think school living is in the public trust. So anybody who wants to pick this thing up can do so. And at the time that Mildred died in 1986, she was driving a movement. She was in her mid 80s, and she was still struggling to get that legacy in place. But at that time, she was working her tail off, trying to establish a network of schools of living, independent schools of living across the country to continue that legacy. And part of our idea, Bob's mind particularly, is to put that information out there so it's accessible to people. If they find that's something that they want to use, then it's theirs. Mm-hmm. We're not planning on we're not going to create a new organization. We're not going to go out and beg for money. We're going to put the stuff out there. We're going to continue to develop the practical side of it. And I've taught gardening. I know a dozen different crafts, from basic wood crafts to welding and running a machine shop. So there are skills that are out there. There is a demand for those skills. We actually have several organizations here in town that are working to restore those skills, basic skills to people. And one of the things that we're thinking of, and partially because of my background in human resource development, is reinventing a skills training system that was very popular back in the 80s and was my employment as the director of a career information system. But putting that back together, I think with the new government, and particularly give a little background, the economic pyramid in the United States, and I think elsewhere in Europe, the top part of it is still pretty solid. The bottom part of it is crumbling. Mm-hmm. So as you were indicating, people don't have the skills. They don't know how to do things. There are so many things that are changing so rapidly that we are looking at developing a new skills training. And it will be a high-tech system. It'll be a virtual system. So we're looking at doing everything from growing tomatoes to building a house. Mm-hmm. And by the way, Borsodi covered that entire spectrum.
So whereabouts can listeners find out about the upcoming information you're talking about there?
It's going onto the Transition Center website, and that's center in the European spelling, CENTRE. And that website's been around for quite a while, but I'm spending my mornings now as I move out of the Borsodi development, revising that website to make that material more readily available. The first book is available as a PDF. And like I said, there's another book that I put together, Self-Reliance, which is the beginning of an educational program. It starts at basics, basically gazing at your navel. But it is based on another series of research with a half a dozen really outstanding mentors over a long period of time. It's a personal development program starting from the ground up. So it's not just personal development. Once you develop a more or less integrated personality and understand what you and life are all about, it's about how you understand your role in the community as a member of the human race. And it moves from there to achieving something Risotti came up with, like I said, developing a sense of agency. Mm-hmm. And our group came up with an idea of a Resilient Learning Institute. And that was a long time before we heard of Borsodi. So one reason I dropped into him was, God, this guy invented that years ago, and we didn't know about it. For one reason, the California Center failed to develop. It was developing right at the time that some of those mentors were at their greatest level of activity out in California. So, there's some lost opportunities there. But the pieces are coming together. And, we're just trying to make that available. Like I said, we're not trying to make any money out of it. We're just trying to put it out there and craft it in such a way that it'll be useful for people.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about Borsodi that you? I mean, obviously there's loads we could add, but is there anything key that you'd like to add that you feel we've missed?
I've tried to profile the man himself,
Mm-hmm.
and that has been very difficult. The few people I've met that knew him, it was so long ago, they couldn't really completely understand him. And one of the things I got out of Mildred's book wasn't what I learned from it, it was the questions that it raised about him and his work. But the one thing I would say is that he was a very complex individual. He was a genius. He had incredible presence, charisma. He could be kind and caring and compassionate, and he could be rough.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a very complex individual. But the other thing is that in the work that I've done, I've composed a list of about 24 things that he innovated. So over the course of his life, even though he went from one thing to the next, he came up with a long series of things that I consider to be his legacy, things to be passed on. The community land trust was one. The local currency was another. He pioneered a model for that has become very popular, and particularly in the UK. The Totnes pound, if you're familiar with that, it was something that Rob Hopkins developed when he came up. But there's a dozen local currencies that came out of what developed from Borsodi's tradition. But he was organic gardener, natural foods. I've worked with there are 3 places in Pennsylvania alone that he inspired that were leaders in the natural food industry over the years. And one of those has been very successful, another is being restored. So, like I said, appropriate technology, the problem-centered approach to education, the organization, the various levels of development from personal to family to community to being a sense of a citizen of the whole world without having a world government. So, that was the thing I'd like to say about him. His contributions are just absolutely incredible.
Wow. That's so really anything along the lines of sort of an organic or sustainability movement in the US today, it likely has some seed of sort of Borsodi influence in there that people just don't know about, or they think it originated somewhere else.
Yeah, he did have an influence. Like I said, there were predecessors. So, but his deal, and again, we talked about it. Was it abstract or was it practical? No, these were things that he did.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was, he experimented. So the organizations didn't necessarily persist other than, like I said, the School of Living, which has been going on since 1934, even though it's on its own path. But he experimented, he left that legacy. And my job has been to try to restore that as much as possible. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
That's all right, no worries. I mean, this is what the podcast's for. I mean, I'm, grateful for you coming on. So, Bill Sharp, thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.